So basically, in the Soviet Union, social sciences were really underdeveloped and very little present. The social sciences were actually erased in the literal sense of the word during the Stalinist period, and they began their reinstitutionalization only after the Second World War, since the last 50s. We can say that before that there's a quite a large period of non-existence of social sciences. So in what follows, I will illustrate this point by analyzing the structure of the global field of scholarly communication in economics, and more specifically its effects on the internationalization strategies of Russian economists. Let's say, even if there were some signs of internationalization, if these social sciences were not isolated, as I have already said, but the fact that the Soviet Union preserved, let's say, artificially this space in national borders for a long time, the Soviet social sciences joined this process of globalization, implying both theoretical and linguistic unification later than in most other countries of the world. Economic sciences were much better, were developed to a much greater scale than any other social science. And if we ask ourselves why this difference, why this exception of economic sciences, I could give some elements of answer to this. First of all, of course, they were important for in terms of ideology, and so they had an important role of justification and normative description of socialist economies. And also they were useful for economic practice. And indeed, economists outnumbered very significantly any other social scientists. And economic research in both theoretical and applied branches was conducted in dozens or even hundreds of research institutions, including those affiliated with ministries, industries, administrative bodies. And also it was taught at the universities and in specialized institutes. But even economic sciences, of course, we cannot say that they developed in a total isolation from what was going on in the West. But it would be right to say that they were always developing under severe ideological pressure and in relative intellectual isolation. And parallel to this process of import of knowledge from the West, the expertise and specific competencies of the Soviet economists and other social scientists lost their value. And for instance, if we look at this case of political economy, its transformation following the collapse of the Soviet Union was conceptualized in terms of a paradigmatic shift or scientific revolution, or even a creation of a totally new science, economics, on the Western model, in place of the political economy of socialism. And everything that was done during the Soviet period was declared to be a pure ideology, not a science. And I think this is really a particularity of the social sciences, which are more sensible to this political, ideological agenda. I think that historians or physicians leave this transition much easier than economists did. And indeed, as we may say, entire domains of knowledge, which was related to political economy of socialism and management of the planned economy, were rapidly displaced by new subjects, by new conceptual tools, and often even the economic language itself had to be upgraded. And many English terms in economy and in other social sciences had no Russian equivalent, so it was really a specific period of renewal of the language of institutions. During all the 90s and even the years 2000s, we could observe a scarcity of qualified faculty in a context of quite huge market demand for education and economics. I can just give you an example of how much this new knowledge, Western economic knowledge, was demanded on the academic market in Russia. For instance, by the year 2000, about a quarter of all undergraduate students in Russia were enrolled in economic departments. But economic, I mean, also applied domains like management, business economics, finance, banking, and so on and so forth. Most Russian institutions in economic sciences did not, and actually still do not, possess financial or symbolic resources to recruit staff in the international academic market. So we can say that up until today, it's quite true to say that the faculties in all Russian universities are still staffed with people who were trained during the Soviet period. So, as we can see, the disciplinary space of economic sciences in today's Russia is characterized by the coexistence and sometimes without any intellectual or institutional connection between the two of very insignificant, numerically internationalized segments, and a majority very poorly integrated into the transnational mainstream. And the effect of the presence of Western-trained economists or sociologists is objectively limited, firstly, by their exclusive orientation towards the international market of ideas, and secondly, by the existence of a large internal market of educational services and scholarly publications, which have a relative autonomy vis-à-vis transnational economics. And the result of this is that Russian economists are really very scarcely visible to colleagues outside of the country. And this holds equally true for other humanities or social science fields. And unlike Russian mathematics or physics, which have an incomparably larger international presence, most of them, they lack international visibility at all. And just to give you some figures, for instance, papers by Russian economists represent only 0.3% of the world production in economics in the 90s and 2000s, while this share is 7.9% in physics and 4.2% in mathematics during the same period. You can see, first, it is very heavily dominated by the English language production, but it's not very new, it's not very specific, let's say. Though its domination of English is less significant in humanities, for instance, in history. But in economics and in physics, and so economics and other social sciences are dominated by the English just as hard exact sciences today. But what is specific of economics is that it's also very heavily dominated by American and British journals and American and British economists. So we can see that USA and England give more than a half of all the output in economics in international databases of publications, such as the Web of Science. And these figures here are based on Web of Science output. As I have already said, in this flow of publications in economics, Russian publications represent only 0.3% of all of the total output. And quite remarkably, the Web of Science set of journals currently contains not a single journal in business and economics produced in Russia, even if there are some bilingual or English language journals. And it indexes only a few dozen research papers by Russian authors per year in this subject category. So I analyzed all the publications of Russian economists in the Web of Science in the 90s and 2000s. And I found three categories of journals in which these publications appeared most often. So the first category is regional or area studies journals, mathematical, and some sectoral economics. And according to my hypothesis, these different categories represent, in fact, the range of strategies for internationalization which are objectively available to Russian economists, having different types of academic expertise or academic competencies. The first category embraces almost the half of all Russian papers during this period. And the set of publications contain a little bit less than 800 papers, and so almost a half of them belong to this first category. And so they appeared in journals specialized in the problems of economic transition and emerging markets. And in fact, these regional journals are international ones, but they have a relatively low status in the international market of scholarly publications as compared to leading American and British venues, which have a more universal appeal. And still, this popularity of regional publications among Russian economists is quite understandable, since leading international journals have very little place for studies of peripheral economies. The second category, what I call mathematical publications, is include papers in mathematical modeling, operational research, game theory, and so on. And most of what is characteristic of this production is that most of these papers are purely mathematical and do not consider any real-world data. And not surprisingly, they are mostly published by mathematicians or mathematical economists affiliated with the Central Economical Mathematical Institute, which was the central institution for this type of research during the Soviet period, and the Institutes of Mathematics, which are all important centers of mathematical economics since the 60s. And as you can understand, the comparative advantage of these authors is their strong mathematical competence, which was often acquired even before the fall of the Soviet Union. But once again, though these venues are quite international in their scope, they are currently not among the top-ranked or most influential journals in economic sciences, so quite peripheral to the core of the discipline. And finally, the third and less numerous category of papers by Russian authors report the results of applied studies in different branches of economics, in different sectors, such as labor economics, social policy, education, or agriculture. And These journals publishing papers in this category are not among the best ranked within the discipline either, as far as applied research is always inferior informal academic hierarchies than the pure theory. However, this, together with theoretical core, this type of journals and papers constitute of what we can call normal science. And this category of papers requires not only local competence, but also the ability to process empirical data using standard econometric techniques and to present findings in a conventional form. And it's revealing that Russian papers in this category are numerically insignificant and also dispersed among different research institutions. Only 20 Russian papers appeared in the 30 most influential journals in economics in the period that I studied. And interestingly, almost all of these papers, like 80%, have international co-authors. And in several cases, the foreign co-author is a member of the Russian diaspora in the United States. And a quarter of papers in this group of the most prestigious publications are authored and co-authored by holders of an American or British degree in economics. And this last factor is particularly important insofar as I found no papers in top journals published by Russian economists alone who didn't have an American degree in economics. And so this fact, particularly in economic science, perfectly illustrates the close relationship between academic socialization in leading mainstream institutions and publications in top journals, of course due to participation in academic networks, but also, and most importantly, due to linguistic and academic competences that are obtained during this education. And also, almost all of these papers consider questions of economic theory and methodology, and very rarely present findings of empirical studies. Internationalization, at least in economics, implies essentially a gain in abstraction and delocalization of research topics. I measured this trend by counting the number of Russian economic papers containing the words Russia or Russian in the titles, keywords, or abstracts. And significantly, these words appear in less than half of all articles, so 326 from 773. And this analysis also shows significant variation in the occurrence of these terms according to the category of publication. Of course, the Russian experience occurs much more frequently in regional papers or on transition or development economics. They also appear in some applied science journals, in which relatively few Russian papers were published. And finally, only a few papers by Russian economists in top disciplinary journals did mention Russia at all. First of all, I think internationalization seems a little bit less problematic in the natural sciences, in a sense that their objects have a more universal character, like particles or galaxies, or something like this. But in social sciences and humanities, the displacement of local subjects and problems might raise a question of even of local competence and capacity of the societies for self-reflection. My second point, which I find might be problematic in this process, is that this process of internationalization affects national fields unevenly. and frequently create a structural conflict between mainstream or globalized and other scholarly communities. And this internationally integrated part becomes really absolutely disconnected from the rest of the domestic academia. And there are even no common language, no common places for socialization for this split community, because they publish their papers in completely different journals. They go to different conferences, and so it creates a problem of cohesion and big fragmentation of a national disciplinary field. The third point is that, as I emphasized, that for internationalization, what is important is not only just the will I want to be international, but the effective socialization in international centers of excellence is really important, and recruitment of professors on the international job market, academic mobility of students, of professors, and so on. And this effort to catch up with disciplinary leaders has for peripheral academic fields a high cost. My fourth point is that the internationalization, as we have seen, strengthens the domination of English language as lingua franca of international science at the expense of all other languages. And this issue of national language I found particularly interesting and fascinating when I look at the Russian academia, because this issue is dealt quite differently from one country to another, and it might be a point of lesser significance, for instance, for smaller academias, smaller in size, and many smaller European countries like Netherlands or Northern Europe almost completely switched to the English language of education and science. But it somehow represents a huge problem for Russian market, for instance, because Russia has a very long tradition and very extended market for education and academic publication in national language, in Russian language. And so the question is it possible, is it imaginable to skip, to shift completely to English, and how to deal with this problem of bilingualism? Yes, I absolutely agree. It's a very important point that also when I was talking about the disconnection of some part of academia from the broader local community of knowledge and the incapacity to produce locally relevant knowledge, it might be a problem. And also sometimes it creates hybrid strategies for some scholars, including myself, that some part of scholarly work is dedicated to more, let's say, local problems, and it's published in a national language. So because if you want to be a part of this scholarly community and of this community in general, to be relevant to different social political discussions, and at the same time there is a very strong imperative to go international, and therefore to which and probably in sociology it's a little bit it's this problem is not as big as in economics, because as I said, it's the real particularity of economics that it's a field which is really hugely unified by the standards imposed by the leading American institutions. Probably in sociology is more polyparadigmatic science and so on. And there are more than one center of sociology in the world. So, but still, I think that this problem persists. we can say that in Russian Soviet science there was also a kind of double switch, but which happened a little bit earlier, probably in the 30s. Before 30s, Russian scientists, internationally recognized and important scientists, they published papers mostly in German, when German was their language of international communication, especially in chemistry and in some fields. And then there was a nationalization of science in the Soviet Union. There was a conscious policy, state policy, which implied nationalization and including the almost complete switch to Russian language. And in fact, the majority of Russian publications in Web of Science, even during the English language publications during the Soviet time, appeared in translated journals, because they were journals of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which were entirely translated into English during the Soviet time. In the initial, there were some programs created by the American government with the same, but it's a different story. And this conscious policy of Soviet government had as a result that for at least 25 years from the 70s already, Russian language was by far the second language of scientific communication in the world, in the numbers of papers. This database of Thomson Reuters, which I used, Web of Science, has a very big bias towards English language and British American production. But I think that it was relevant for my study, for this particular study, because what I wanted to analyze was precisely how this academic hierarchy was functioned, how it was structured. And if you want to see the most prestigious publications, most prestigious means which have the highest impact factor, they are all indexed in Web of Science, right? So my goal was not to analyze all the existing production of Russian scientists, but probably the most visible, the most international. So I think that in this sense, the choice of Web of Science was relevant. But otherwise, I completely agree that impact factor is extremely biased and unuseful when we want to evaluate social sciences or human sciences. For some of the reasons I already mentioned in my talk, and that you mentioned in your question as well, that human and social sciences are much more linked to the local object, local competencies, national languages, and which are by definition peripheral to this global international academic hierarchy of prestige. I'm glad that you say that you recognize that these points, the problematic points or challenges of globalization, which I enumerate in my conclusion, that you find them relevant for every country. That was my aim, or to some extent at least. Yeah. So yes, I think I'm convinced that it's not only the problems of post-Soviet academia, but some of these problems are probably accentuated in the case of the Soviet academia for very specific reasons or contextual variables. For instance, as I've already mentioned, the Soviet academia joined the process of internationalization or globalizations later than many other countries, right? So probably it was more sharp, and more also produced more split among different generations of social scientists. Or also the issue of language, I think, also quite specific to the Russian case. Yes, especially as Russia has this tradition to be the second language of international communication, and still until today, there were some voices of academics in Russia raised against this new state policy of internationalization, saying that if foreign colleagues want to know the results obtained by our scientists, they need to learn Russian. So, this kind of statements sounds completely outdated and irrelevant today, but there are still people who live somehow in this paradigm of Russian as the important language of scientific communication.